Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing well. There's kitties behind me. Not sure you can see them. They're pretty cute. They're wrestling, biting each other. Pretty darn cute. Anyway, hope you're doing well. Um, what's new? Hopefully you all got the message that we have changed the testing for the rest of the quarter. Rather than being a two-test system, we're going to have one test that will just be held in finals week. And just to remind you, the reason for that is we're going sadly a little slower than we usually do, and we just wouldn't have enough questions for a test next week. And I think this probably is the preference of most people. And I realize that does put a little bit more pressure on your final exam, because there will be a few more questions on that final exam than you had on the midterm. So it does count just a little bit more. Probably be closer to 60, 65 questions on the midterm, where you had 52, I think, on the midterm. But to kind of offset that, I'll be doing a review session myself that will hopefully help you. And I'm going to be giving you an extra day or so for the window in which you can take the test. Okay. But I announced this both in class last time and on our iLearn site, but let's just stop there and see if anyone has any questions about that change. Anything? You doing good? All right. All right. Anyone else got a haircut over the weekend? Yeah. My wife does it, kind of since quarantine, we've kind of all been cutting each other's hair in the family. Doesn't take a lot of work to cut my hair, as you can imagine. I think probably my dog Max could do it if he wanted to, but hopefully you're doing better with your hair than I am with mine. All right, any questions? Is this mic on? Is anybody out there? Just say hi to make sure everything's working. Thank you. Okay, you're waving. Good. Thank you. All right. Then what we're going to do actually is skip ahead a tiny bit. This is going to be our last lecture on something related to a visual perception. As you'll see, it's going to expand into another modality as well. But it's one of my favorite topics. I've always been interested in face perception. And we'll spend today's lecture, and well, hopefully we'll get through most of this today and start talking about sound on Thursday. Okay, we have 5 lectures left. Is that right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, because next week we just have Tuesday's class, not Thursday's class. So hopefully we'll be able to get through much of the important stuff in the course. All right, so let's do some faces. And for those of you that have taken my PSYC132 class, and might be about a quarter to a third of you, there's going to be some overlap, just so you know. Remember, in that class, we talk about faces as well, and we're going to introduce the topic in the same way. But, don't worry if you haven't taken that class, or if you have, I'm sure it's going to be nice to refresh it either way. So let's go ahead and share the screen. What we're going to do to introduce the topic of face perception is talk about something that I think most people find very interesting. And it is, wow, I was just talking to my son about this yesterday as we were watching some football. When you see, well, this came up a little early. All right, anyway, when you see an animated face, and they were showing this on the football game we were watching last night. They had animated players, kind of like you would see from, a video game, Madden football or something like that. It is so odd sometimes to see their faces. There just seems to be something eerie about animated faces that are not quite real. And I think one of the most striking examples of this, and the one I think is most intuitive for your generation, is a movie called The Polar Express, which you'll be seeing soon, I imagine, multiple times on TV as the holidays come up. And I imagine most of you have seen this at some point or another. It's now become kind of a Christmas regular. This is a movie that is all animated and stars the voice of Tom Hanks, as well as kind of his likeness and a couple of different characters. about a train that goes to the North Pole or something like that. Can't remember the details now. But this is a still from the movie. And when this movie came out, it came out the exact same day another beloved animated movie came out called The Incredibles. And I assume most of you have seen that, either the first or second one, which is, they're just terrific, really fun, funny films. And there's a still from The Incredibles. Now, when these two films came out, a lot was made in the press, in the reviews, in the coverage of kind of the making of both of these movies, about the difference in animation style. And you can see this readily from these two stills. What the folks that did the animation for The Incredibles decided to do was to actually, kind of use cartoonish type of caricaturized faces. So, they look like human faces. They were in kind of, right? They're elongated here, but there's enough facial information there that, you can depict emotion and, the fact that the characters in the family were related to each other. But, it's caricaturized. As you can see, this is, kind of different from, it's more like a cartoonish face, we'd say, than a human face. On the other hand, the Polar Express decided to go for an animation style that they felt was as realistic as they could do it at the time. And that's what you're seeing here. Now, you might know a little bit about this, how they did the Polar Express. What they did for Tom Hanks, for example, is they used this point tracking technique where they had him wear a black suit that had little kind of points on it, not unlike the point light walkers we saw last class. But what this does in this context is it allows computers to actually track Tom Hanks's movements pretty precisely. And they also did something like that with his face. They used another technique, which you can't see there. But the idea was they wanted to make the animation in the Polar Express as realistic as possible. And they spent millions of dollars doing this. And the question is, was it worth it? Well, when the two films came out, the reviews of both films were pretty positive. The Incredibles did much better than the Polar Express when it came out. But there was a common criticism across all reviews of the Polar Express, and it was in the depiction, the animated depiction of the human forms, especially the faces. Thank you, Julie. I completely forgot about this. I am enabling the transcription now. Thank you. And as you can see, there is something really creepy about the faces that were depicted in the Polar Express. They kind of look a little bit more human in some ways, but in being closer to a human face, they seem, I don't know, almost zombie-ish. And this is something that was known at the time, and the animators of The Incredibles were very aware of this. They knew that if you try to make an animated face look human and don't do it perfectly, it seems to look scarier than if you use a cartoon face like they did here. So here's a face that's less like a human face, but it's not as scary as the face that seems like it's more like the human face. And this is something that's known in the cartoon or movie and video animation world, as well as it's very prevalent in the computer game world, where if you try to make a face look too realistic and don't nail it, that it becomes scarier than if the face is less realistic. Scary in the sense that it just looks eerie. It looks like there's something off. Uncanny is the word that's often used for this type of appearance. Uncanny means, well, it kind of looks real and it kind of doesn't look real, and that unrealness makes it look a little creepy. And it seems then that there's a range of animation where it just can, kind of give you the heebie-jeebies. It just looks a little strange. There's some more of the animation from the Polar Express, and I imagine that you could end up with nightmares of this guy. Tom Hanks character looked a little better because he was more recognizable. The kids seemed to look especially odd. If you're familiar with this, you probably know. But even the Tom Hanks character had the kind of odd, kind of zombie, kind of undead appearance to it. And so what the uncanny valley, that term refers to, is a range in which the realism makes whatever is not realistic uncanny. It makes it look kind of odd, kind of a little scary. Okay. And that's what's being portrayed down here. You don't need to know the details of this figure at all, but it's just trying to portray to you that, you know, if you make an animated character or a robot or a stuffed animal or something like that more and more realistic, at first it's not bad, but as it gets closer and closer to realistic, so what this is showing here is maybe realism along this axis and what people feel is familiar or comfortable. So this is people's kind of, I guess, perceptual interpretations or maybe feelings about the characters based on the animation. And at first, you know, as you make things a little bit more realistic, you know, it's not bad and it seems more familiar. But then all of a sudden, if you make things too realistic and they're not realistic enough, one's familiarity, one's ease, one's, I guess, identifiability, how well they identify with the characters drops kind of dramatically until you get to a point where you've really animated or created a robot that looks very, very real. So this is the point where the kind of a perceptual experience of the viewer is kind of uncanny. Things seem, you know, zombie-ish or eerie or something like that until they get back real. The example I use in my book is the robots from the you know, first Star Wars movies, C3PO and R2D2, and you know, you can find them both charming. But if I asked you which was more familiar, you'd probably say, I guess C3PO is more familiar in that it looks a little bit more human. Say, okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a dress on C3PO. And how would you now experience C3PO? Oh, that's kind of fun. Okay, that's great. C3PO likes to wear a dress. That's great. Okay, now I'm going to put a wig on C3PO. And you say, that's wonderful. Okay, C3PO is now wearing a wig. It's kind of charming. That's great. Good for C3PO. And then I say, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a rubber mask on C3PO. And it's kind of a realistic rubber mask. How does he look now? Or how does they look now, I guess? And you might say, well, it's as if all of a sudden C3PO doesn't look that fun anymore. It's kind of creepy. C3PO is kind of creepy in that situation. And that's what's happening here is you're making C3PO more and more charming as you're putting on the dress and the wig. But all of a sudden, when you put that rubber mask on, oh boy, it starts looking weird. Okay, maybe you can think of other examples from your video games or something like that. There's tons of examples there. So that's the uncanny valley. I think there's a robot example I have here too. Yeah, this is often discussed with regard to robot, and you can imagine as you know, as companies are starting to design robots that will interact with at some point more or less. And some of these are, you know, I think real robots that we can kind of interact with. The question is how to make them, you know, appealing, how to make them, you know, I guess something that people are comfortable interacting with. So these are all the different robot kind of levels. It's an old picture. The robots have, you know, images of the robot appearances have evolved since then. But it's talking about, you know, here they're kind of cute. They're, you know, these are the kind of cute robots you see in movies. And then as you start putting a face on the robots, they start getting creepy. And if you were to see this moving, these robots moving, you'd realize, boy, they can look really creepy. Even if in a photograph, the faces don't look terrible, when you see them move, they look creepy. So this isn't just a problem for the Polar Express and animated films. It's a problem, as I said, for video games. It's a problem for robot. Some interesting things about this, though, that I wanted to point out. And first is, this does seem to be specific. The issue seems to be specific to human forms. So film animators, computer animated characters in movies have been pretty successfully done for animals like, King Kong and animals, animated films where you've seen talking dogs and talking cats and things like that. It doesn't look bad. It doesn't give us the kind of heebie-jeebies where you see something like this might, right? And the other thing is, it seems to be especially conspicuous. This uncanny sort of experience seems to be especially conspicuous with faces. That's where we seem to notice it most. Yeah, you can see an animated character moving. You can say, yeah, it's not quite moving well, and that sometimes you see that in video games, especially. But boy, when that face turns and speaks into the camera, or you can see the face speaking in a video game, that's where you really notice it. I think those of you that play video games would often agree with that, I think. There's a couple of other things I want to just mention. And if you're interested in this type of thing, you can look online. There's tons of great articles on it. It's also discussed in the book I wrote that is covered in PSYC132. But I was able to interview somebody who was on a design team that did animation for a movie called The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, I think is its title. And it's a movie with Brad Pitt. It came out in 2009, something like that. And it won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. And the reason is because they were able to basically deal with this uncanny valley problem. They did an animation of Brad Pitt's face. The first half of the movie, you're never seeing Brad Pitt. You see his animated face. But it is very compelling. You do not get that uncanny valley feeling from Brad Pitt's face. And I interviewed the main animator right after I think it was the morning after they won the Academy Awards. I just happened to set the interview up for the day after the Academy Awards. Just kind of lucked out, and they were flying. They were absolutely ecstatic that they won the award. And we talked about how they were able to do this. And they said that they had to pay such close attention to detail. And every time they improved one aspect of the realism of Brad Pitt's face, they would notice another issue of the face. So if they improved the motion in Brad Pitt's face, they would then notice that the skin didn't look quite right. And then they'd improve the skin by kind of giving it a little bit more translucent. Skin does reflect light, but it also absorbs light, and that lower layers of the skin reflect light through the upper layers. I mean, there's all this detail. One thing that they really spent a lot of time in, and they felt like this is what kind of allowed them to really provide a compelling animation, was eye moisture, of all things. And so they to get the eyes to look right, they projected a video of, I think, the animator that I was interviewing. They took videos of his eyes moving back and forth and projected it on this giant screen in their studios, and looked at it very carefully. And what they found was that when a person's eye moves to the left, there's a little bit more moisture on the left side of the eye than the right, and then when it moves back to the right, there's a little bit more moisture on the right side of the eye than the left. And until they were able to get that, did they have a compelling Brad Pitt face. And so there was kind of this all or none rule. Either you got everything right, and if you didn't get everything right, the things that you did get right made the things that were wrong more conspicuously wrong. Kind of a fascinating sort of thing, and it's something that animators know now, beyond this successful film. But what it suggests is, if nothing else, the brain is extraordinarily sensitive to faces. It really, really is, and it's something scientists have known for a long time. With regard to the amount of information that's available in a face. But through these demonstrations of the uncanny valley in these, in the kind of entertainment contexts, it really is a really compelling demonstration of this. It's really very, very strong. It doesn't take very much for people to realize how accurate a depiction of a face needs to be before our brain is willing to accept it. I should just mention, as another little aside about the studio and this very successful animation company, the movie they made after that, after the Curious Case of Benjamin Button, was the Tron movie. So I can't remember what the more modern Tron movie is that came out in the 2010s. There's a subtitle to it, Tron : something. And what they did is they animated Jeff Bridges to make him, so the older Jeff Bridges can interact with the young Jeff Bridges. So they animated the young Jeff Bridges, and they used basically the same techniques. But if you go back and look at that movie, I don't think they were 100% successful with the young Jeff Bridges. So even after they incorporated all of what they had learned from their successful Brad Pitt animation, the young Jeff Bridges animation, I don't think looks nearly as compelling. And I think they have an uncanny valley problem in there too. And I wouldn't be surprised if the animators were now aware of that sort of thing. So even after they thought they solved it, other issues are, started to arise that made the next film difficult. So that's how sensitive the brain is. I mean, that's really what they're working against, the perceptual sensitivity of the brain. So I think that's a nice kind of way to start talking about faces. I see there's a lot of questions and comments. I'll get to those in just a second. But what I'd like to continue with in our introduction is the fact. So why are we so sensitive to faces? Why are faces such a important part of perceptual processing? And I think it's probably because faces communicate to us so well, so richly, and so efficiently. So we can think about faces as communication. Faces communicate information as efficiently as anything you might imagine. So yes, I mean, you can talk about the internet communicating efficiently and all that sort of stuff. But when it comes to, the speed to which the brain processes facial information and an array of different types of facial information, I don't think there's anything that comes close, which makes our brains especially sensitive to faces. When things are a little off, our brain goes ding, ding, ding. There's something weird about it. What communicates in a face? Well, identity, of course, who a person is. That's the first thing we think of course, but it's a lot more than that. Intent. And what I mean here by intent is what somebody intends towards us, whether it's an intention to, communicate, to interact, in a casual manner, in a more formal manner, in an angry manner, in a loving manner. All those sorts of dimensions have to be perceived spontaneously, immediately. We need to know what people intend towards us. Most of the time it's positive or neutral, but we need to be able to know if someone's angry, if someone's upset, and it needs to be known very quickly for our successful interactions and potentially our safety. Right? What else? Fitness. And what I mean here by fitness is attractiveness. We need to be able to extract that information in order to choose mates, and choose mates that we will potentially have successful, healthy offspring with. And that's something that is communicated very, very effectively, very efficiently. We'll talk about, how that is detected, and whether there is a universal aspect to what people consider attractive in faces. And then we'll probably save this mostly for our next discussion, maybe next week. And what I'm listing here is linguistic content. And really what I'm discussing is lip reading. And I don't think this is something that I used to have to kind of convince people that they used lip read information, but now, having worn masks for so long, you're probably aware of this, that it is harder for us to understand each other while we're wearing masks. And yes, it is because, a mask will quiet the voice a little bit, but, most of these don't. And I'll tell you, the medical masks that people wear, the disposable ones, they do very little to the sound, right? What they do is they cover up the visual information that our brain is always using when we interact with people we can see, right? And we have face-to-face interactions. Even if we aren't aware of how much visual information we're using, typically we are using visual information. And I think more of us become aware of that now that we've gone through a year and a half of not being able to see each other's mouths move. Okay, all of this is conveyed very, very quickly and in a very, very rich way, which kind of begs the question, is there something special about face perception? Is face perception different from the other types of perception we've discussed, motion perception or distance perception? Or maybe we can talk about another class of stimuli. When we perceive faces, do we perceive in a way that's different from how we perceive, chairs, or how we perceive apples, or how we perceive other animals, for example? Is there something special in the brain that allows us to perceive all of this rich content so efficiently and so effectively? Okay, so that's the question we're going to kind of drive today. Is face perception special? But we'll take our little break here and see what your comments and questions are and do our polling question. All right, lots of chat. Cool. All right, Phoebe loves learning faces. Yeah, me too. Yeah, Bryce, I'm with you. I think the Polar Express is really creepy looking. I don't know, maybe after if you've seen it a few times, it gets a little bit more comfortable. But, whenever it pops up, on the TV, I'll watch it for a few minutes. It's like, oh boy, this is going to take some getting used to. I get this feeling with animated sketches from police reports. That's interesting. Those freak you out in Nelly. It could be because they tap into the uncanny valley as well. Thanks, Yanelli, for that. The elves in Polar Express creep me out too, Jenna. Cool. The same day. I enjoyed the movie and same Daisy. Yeah. Can you briefly explain the fitness part again? We will be, okay, Phoebe, I'm going to get into that in some detail. What I'm talking about with regard to fitness really is going to be related to how we perceive attractiveness and why we perceive attractiveness. I'll be talking about it in some detail. Okay, that was just a general introduction. So I'll be going through that, Phoebe. Okay. Other comments or questions about the Polar Express or Uncanny Valley or anything like that? Yeah, you liking the cats? Yeah, I hope they're not too distracting. Hopefully they'll kind of offset the uncanny valley. All right. Thanks, Allison. Okay, let's just quickly do our question. And it's a question on the uncanny valley. Should be very easy for you. Oops. Uh-oh. Huh. Hold on just a second. Oh boy. Okay, well, let's see how I'm going to be able to do this now. Sorry, everybody. Wow. So, I've got a little problem here. I am able to see all the questions of the polling ones since the beginning of the quarter, but I can't scroll down. It's not letting me scroll down. Let me just try this one more time. Oh my gosh. Okay. I've got to do a little thing here. No one panic. This will just take a second. I'm going to get rid of some of these earlier questions. All right. And this should allow me to get these questions in. Get rid of one more. Don't want to deprive you of your questions. Okay. Here we go. Let's try this again. Yes, good. It worked. Okay, here's your question. The uncanny valley phenomena shows that A, we are very perceptually tolerant of faces that are not quite realistic. B, we are very perceptually sensitive to human faces. C, we find faces that are not quite realistic creepy. Or D, both B and C. Go ahead, I'll give you a few minutes to do this one. You're doing great. Okay, let's go back here. You did great. You got the right answer, most of you. The correct answer is D. It's both B and C. We are very perceptually sensitive to human faces. That was kind of the whole point of introducing the face topic by going through the uncanny valley. And it also suggests that when faces are not quite realistic enough, they are creepy. So the correct answer is both B and C. We are not tolerant to faces that are not quite realistic. That kind of goes against the uncanny valley, which all of you were aware of. So I don't think I need to go through that more. All right. Any questions or comments before we continue our lecture then? All right. Oh, good. Jenna has a good example. Tom Morrow and Asimo the Honda robot. Yeah, Asimo is cute. I don't remember Tom Morrow, but I will look him up after lecture. Thank you for another example of the uncanny valley, Jenna. Okay, let's share our screen. So let's go back to this. And again, what we're going to be talking about besides faces, or besides the kind of perceptual importance of faces, is this idea of a speciality in the brain. So is there a component of the brain, it's kind of the big picture here, that is kind of set aside for face perception, that uses specialized processes for face perception? That's kind of the big question we're going to go for today. And when we talk about a specialization, one way we can discuss this is through a concept called modularity, which I'll define for you in just a second. But I'm going to give you another term, and I don't think it's on the test. It's called phrenology. I wouldn't worry too much about this, but some of you might know phrenology because I think it's kind of become a fun kind of kind of thing to talk about. Well, it's kind of in the realm of things like astrology and stuff like that. It's not scientific, although at the time when it first came out, they kind of thought of it that way. Phrenology was an old kind of game people would play, called a parlor game. They would play in the 19th century because they didn't have computers and everything. And what people would do is they would try to infer things about each other's personality and kind of mental capacity by touching the skull. Right. I don't want to get too far into this because it really is just a way of introducing modularity. But what you would do, maybe it was a nice way of kind of getting to know people too. After dinner, you would kind of take turns touching each other's skulls. And from the indentations on the skull, you try to infer what a person's, character was like. Like, oh, Rosenblum has a big bump right here. He must have a very small kind of mathematics capacity or something like that. He's got an indentation here. He has terrible social skills. That's the sort of thing you would do in phrenology. Okay. Now, again, it's like astrology. I mean, it's not really based on anything scientific or anything like that, but it was kind of a fun thing to do, kind of, just a way to, probably a conversation starter, a way for people to get to know and meet each other and all that sort of thing. But there was one thing about it that we kind of do maintain in our current understanding of the brain. So I should mention that phrenology was based kind of on the idea that if you had bumps and indentations, that you were kind of feeling what was going on inside the brain, right? Again, there's nothing to that whatsoever. But the idea that the brain has kind of special components in it that are kind of dedicated to different types of functions is something that is maintained. And that's what the idea of a module is. Now, the notion of a module has changed over the history of cognitive and perceptual psychology, but the general idea is the same. What a module is a functionally and anatomically distinct part of the brain that's responsible for, in many cases, all the input and output related to that function. What do I mean by that? Responsible for all the input and output. The idea that we might have a module responsible for faces that is not only going to be responsible for perceiving faces and facial expression, but also kind of initiating our own facial expressions. That's what I mean by output in this case. We might have a module for language, where it's responsible not only for understanding language, but producing language. The idea that we have specialized components in the brain. Now, as I said, that notion has developed over the last, say, 20 years of cognition and neuroscience and perception as we're talking about it, about, how kind of, insulated are these modules, how, how far-reaching is their kind of function, right? Do we really have a piece of the brain that's responsible for both the input and output? Well, historically, that's what was thought to occur, right? So we're going to talk about it like that initially, at least, and then see how more modern concepts of modules now exist. So it is a concept that has been maintained. It's, not like phrenology. Phrenology is kind of something that you can do fun on the internet or, at parties or whatever. But this is, kind of a concept that is not too far distant from that, in that it kind of assumes that there are parts of the brain that are responsible for distinct functions. Okay? Probably something you've heard of before. Oh, here are some examples. So stereopsis, right? We've talked about stereopsis. It is thought that there's a part of the visual brain that is responsible for stereopsis, another part responsible for color, parts responsible for sound localization, which we'll talk about. You might have talked a tiny bit about this in discussion section, I don't know, but we will be talking about how we localize sounds very soon. And then the ones we'll be talking about most in this class are the modules for speech and faces, okay? And we'll discuss whether or not there is good evidence, especially today we'll be talking about whether there's good evidence for a part of the brain that is dedicated to faces, and not just a part of the brain, but a kind of functional distinctiveness for faces. Do we perceive faces in a way that uses processes we don't apply to other types of visual stimuli? So that's kind of the big question we're going to be asking here. So we're asking two questions in one. We're asking something about face perception, but we're also asking something about how modules might work, how functionally and anatomically distinct processes of the brain might work that are separate from other types of processes, okay? What are some characteristics of modules? Well, first, if the brain has modules, we wouldn't want it to have a module for every class of stimuli we would ever encounter, right? We'd want that class of stimuli, we'd want that category of stimuli to have ecological relevance. We need it to be something that is very important, for our survival. So the term ecologically here, I realize it's not related to the ecological approach. It's just a term that really we could have used the term evolutionary relevance, right? That it has, a lot of importance for the survival of, ourselves and our species. Right. So you wouldn't imagine that the brain would evolve a module for something like tin cans. Can you guys see that? Barely, right? Because of the way that animation works, right? Or cell phones or something like that, right? You wouldn't assume that, the brain has evolved a module for those things. But it would make sense if the brain had a module for something like faces, right? Or something like speech perception, because these functions have very strong ecological relevance, right? They are really important in our perceptual repertoire, for our survival ultimately, right? So that would make some sense. And faces seem to have that, right? As I said, it's so important for us to be able to extract all this information so quickly, including, what somebody intends towards us. What else? Anatomical and functional distinctiveness. And let's address anatomical distinctiveness. So we should see through a number of different means evidence that there is a part of the brain that's set aside for these sorts of modular functions, right? So here's what this is showing here is module for the language function, Broca's area and Wernicke's area for speech production and speech perception, but we do know that these things work together. Is there an anatomical piece set aside for face perception? That's the sort of thing we would expect, right? It's kind of compartmentalized physically in the brain. But the other aspect of this, the functional distinctiveness, we're going to spend a lot of time on today. You would expect that not only is there, kind of a separate spatial part of the brain where, this information is processed, but that the information is processed in a way that is different from how information is processed for other types of stimuli. As I said, you would expect that there would be different processes for faces if it is something that's anatomically distinct and ecologically relevant, that is different from how we process, the visual information for tin cans or cell phones or, houses or bikes or chairs or something like that, right? There should be something in how that information is processed that appears like it's different. Maybe it's more efficient, right? Maybe it uses special like little tricks or something like that to achieve that efficiency. What else though? Well, people who've thought a lot about modules have come up with these other ideas. And I think that even if these are not necessarily things that are, make or break sort of characteristics anymore, I think they're intuitive. I think they make good sense for us to understand something about the functional distinctiveness of these modules. So no conscious awareness of the process. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that, okay, so I put a chessboard up there. And the reason I did is as a contrasting example, where when we play chess, we are aware of the process, right? We kind of think about each other's moves. We think about our strategies. We infer another person's strategies. We are kind of mentally getting into the process of playing chess. That is not how we would think of perceptual functions that have this important kind of modular characteristics. The idea here would be for modules, we are not aware of the processes that are being used, okay? So maybe the most intuitive example here is, speech. So when you hear speech, you hear it as speech sounds, right? You really just hear the sounds of speech. You hear syllables, you hear vowels, you hear consonants. You don't hear kind of the more superficial aspects. Like when I say superficial, there's a little noise there and there's a little burst of sound and there's a little whistle and all these things. You don't hear that, okay? When you listen to Morse code or something, you can absolutely hear the little pieces of it, the little kind of superficial pieces. But when we listen for speech, you don't, and you're not aware of what goes on inside the process that's kind of bringing all those cues together, right? Before we get into that, let me think of one other example. Sound localization, which you'll learn about very soon. I'll just give you a tiny little taste of that right now to make this point. When you hear a sound coming from your right side, like that, one way we determine from the right is that the sound hits our right ear before our left ear, and our brain interprets that as that the sound's over here. We are not aware consciously of the sound coming to our right ear before our left ear. We have no conscious sense of that. What we are conscious of is the sounds over there on our right side, okay? So that might be an example of a module where we don't have awareness of the process, okay? Kind of aligned with that is this next idea, and that is the idea that we cannot penetrate the process with outside knowledge of what's going on. So that's the idea of cognitive impenetrability, which is a fancier term than it needs to be. All it's saying is that we can't kind of, defeat the processing of the module. We can't stop the processing of the module. It kind of happens automatically. It's impenetrable by outside knowledge, by any sort of cognitive outside knowledge that we might have. Okay. And there I have our Mueller-Lyer illusion. And this should make it very clear to you. Remember, even if we take out rulers and measure these things as being the same length, the lines in between the arrows as being the same length, then we sit back again, the illusion still works. I have now this outside kind of, awareness that the lines are actually the same length, but the illusion still works, suggesting that, I could not kind of defeat the processing that was involved in the illusion by this outside knowledge. Okay, the processing of the illusion was impenetrable by my outside knowledge. That's what's meant by cognitive impenetrability. And here's some more intuitive examples that do involve face perception. I think all of us can see faces in these images, right? Whether it's the face in the front of a car, okay, it's Miata, the face in a cheese sandwich, right? It's a nice little pleasant face you're looking at there, or the silhouette of a face on the side of a mountain. And in fact, if you look around the room you're in now, if you look at an electrical outlet, I think, when you were a kid probably, and even now, if you look at an electrical outlet, you'll see a kind of a face, kind of a face going, oh, like that, having an expression. And it happens all the time where we kind of automatically see faces in objects and images that don't really have faces in them, right? So our brain is kind of like looking for faces all the time. And even if we really know, consciously we're looking at a rock formation, we're looking at a cheese sandwich, looking for at the front of a car and not a face, our face brain, processes tries to find faces and things that we know aren't even faces. I think it's another example of a cognitive impenetrability as well. Okay. And then finally, we're going to talk about this at the end of our discussion of faces. The module is considered to take in all relevant information that would be useful for processing that class of stimuli. We're going to see this when we talk about speech too. It's going to be an important part of our speech discussion in a few weeks. But we're going to be talking about, with regard to faces, that the module isn't just dealing with a single sense modality when it's processing information. It will take in information from about faces from other modalities as well. And what I mean here by modality is other senses. So yes, most of the time we're perceiving faces, we're seeing faces. It's coming through our visual system. But as we'll see at the end of our discussion, we also can perceive faces through touch, even if we've had little to no experiences doing so. And the same types of processing seems to apply to face recognition through touch as it does through vision. So that's what that last characteristic of a module means when I say all relevant information is available. It's not just relevant information through vision, for example, with faces. It can also come through other senses as well. Okay. So we're going to talk about each of these things, and as we do so, we'll go through some of the more interesting aspects of face perception. The first is ecological relevance, and we'll talk about that by discussing a few different dimensions of face information that we use. The first one is attractiveness. So let's consider how facial attractiveness might have an ecological purpose, an evolutionary purpose. And I've already kind of hinted at this, and one of you asked about this. This is the fitness question. if we are able to extract fitness information for someone's reproductive potential, then you might think that we would have a brain that was very sensitive to facial attractiveness and did weight facial attractiveness heavily when it came to general attractiveness and other sorts of characteristics as well. So this is always a little bit of a controversial topic, right? Attractiveness, or how important is it to us in picking a mate? And obviously, we're much more sophisticated beings than just, picking a mate based on facial attractiveness, but facial attractiveness does seem to have an effect on our social lives, our mate selection, and that sort of thing. Of course, a lot of other things come into play. I'm very aware of that, compatibility, intellect, all that sort of stuff. But does facial attractiveness, is it important? And yeah, it is. It does have social consequences. Maybe this doesn't come as a complete surprise if you've taken other social psychology, if you've taken social psychology classes or personality classes, intro, that, where you go through these sorts of things. But we should talk about it here too, because it is relevant to our understanding of modularity and the evolutionary importance of facial attractiveness. So you may have heard of the halo effect, and then the halo effect is, I'm laughing because this is my example of a less attractive baby. I think that's a perfectly attractive baby. It just has a particularly funny face right there. But even at this young age, okay, parents, teachers will ascribe more positive personality characteristics to infants that are considered more attractive than infants that are less attractive. Now, when you're a parent, you think all infants are attractive. Of course, you think your own infants are the most attractive, but I think all infants are adorable, beautiful, right? But, you can ask people to rate attractiveness in infants, put them in order from the most attractive to the least attractive facially in infants, and then look to see how, you look to see, these infants in the real world, the ones we've taken pictures of, how their teachers, how their parents and parents' friends ascribe different personality characteristics to them, and they will ascribe more positive attributes to the attractive ones than the less attractive ones. So yeah, even at this level, these halo effects where people ascribe ascribe positive characteristics, positive personality characteristics to more attractive people, more people with more attractive faces, occurs for infants, and it also occurs for adults, right? The same sort of thing will occur for adults, that people who are rated as having more attractive faces will generally be given more attractive or positive personality characteristics, will be ascribed more positive personality characteristics. And this doesn't just happen when it comes to looking at a face and kind of judging it explicitly. It comes to instances where faces are presented subliminally. And this is how something like this might be done. So you're sitting there in front of a computer screen as a subject, and all of a sudden, you see a flash on the screen, but you can't make out what that flash is. In fact, a lot of people don't even see a flash. And then what comes up is an image of, I guess, a Chinese character, something that looks kind of like a Chinese character. Chinese character meaning like, a lettering or something you would use for writing a word, right? And your job, not knowing Chinese, is not to try to guess what the meaning is or anything like that, but just say, how attractive you think that Chinese letter is, that Chinese character. And, you'd rate it on a scale from 1 to 10. Yeah, it's a nice one. I like that one. I'll give it a 8, right? And you go through a whole bunch of these. And not each time, every once in a while, you'll see a flash on the screen before the Chinese character comes up. But you don't see what it is, that flash, right? What that flash is is a quick, a ridiculously quick presentation of a person's face that is either considered attractive or less attractive. You consciously do not know it. It is below your awareness. It is subliminal, right? But what it ends up doing is affecting how attractive you rate the Chinese character you see afterwards. So you get a kind of a halo effect from an unconsciously presented, a subliminally presented face that is affecting how, I guess, attractive, how pretty you think that Chinese character is. So even at that level, right, our brain is processing attractiveness, facial attractiveness information so quickly that it can have an effect without us even being aware that we're seeing a face. That's really speaking to the importance of that type of dimension to our brain, right? What else? Well, you've probably heard this. And again, we're talking, this isn't absolutely determinate, but yeah, people with more attractive faces are often shown to have more professional success for whatever reasons, right? There is a bit of a correlation, and this stuff is always very, very complicated, but facial attractiveness is correlated with success, professional success. It is also correlated with mental and physical health. And this is where things, I think, start getting a little bit interesting, especially when you talk about dimensions such as facial symmetry. So what I mean by symmetry is like, having an imaginary line that goes down your face. If a person's face is pretty symmetric on the left and right, then it is a good predictor of both their physical and mental health. Individuals who have less symmetric faces, and here I'm doing a little warning here, don't go look in the mirror now and say, oh my gosh, is my face symmetric or asymmetric? We're talking about pretty notable asymmetric faces. More than most of us, most of the asymmetric, all of us are a little asymmetric, but we're talking about pretty drastic asymmetric faces. Those individuals with asymmetric faces generally have lower physical and mental health. So you're starting to see here that there might be some correlation between facial attractiveness as measured in its symmetry with physical and mental health. And then finally, there is this data. I mean, it has been replicated that despite all the complicated things that go into choosing a mate, that coupling is somewhat predicted by the attractiveness of the people in the couple, right? So in these sort of studies, people see 10 pictures of men, 10 pictures of women, and they rate them from most attractive, or they order them from most attractive to least attractive. And as it turns out, these individuals are from couples, right? And, there will be a correlation where the people within the couples will be kind of equally or in a range of similar attractiveness, facial attractiveness. So there is that predictor. I know, you're thinking, I think this all the time. My wife's much more beautiful than I am, so I'm a perfect deviation from this, right? Luckily, I have all my hair. I'm kidding. But, so certainly there's all these, examples we can think of that aren't true. But that being said, when you look at kind of the big picture, when you look at the big data, there are correlations in attractiveness that are predictive of how people will choose mates. Okay. At the very least, and I understand this stuff is controversial. I understand that there's a lot of things that else can go into this sort of thing. It's perfectly fine. But I think what this suggests is, despite what we might want to think, that attractiveness has this ecological relevance that bears on our social world, right? What makes a face attractive now? Well, there are some cultural universals, right? So you can think about, well, what makes a face attractive I don't know, the Midwest might not be the same thing as what makes a face attractive in the South, or in California or something like that. What makes a face attractive in an Asian country might not be the same as what makes a face attractive in an African country or something like that. And that is true. There certainly are cultural differences, and there certainly are historical differences too. Absolutely. So over time, what people valued in facial attractiveness has changed. But there are also some universals that need to be considered. So, whether you are in an African country or in an Asian country, whether you are, judging faces now, this year, 2021, or in 1821, there are some commonalities in what people find attractive in faces. One of them is something I've already mentioned: symmetry, right? So symmetrical faces that don't deviate, across this kind of imaginary line from side to side, they are more or less symmetrical, are considered attractive. Now, that can be taken to another level, and it has been before, through artistic sorts of kind of techniques and that sort of thing. So the notion of the golden proportions was very popular in artistic rendering since the Renaissance, I believe, where if you wanted to depict a person as attractive in a painting or in a sculpture, you would try to achieve these proportions in your rendering. And the idea here, let's see, how does this work? The face could be divided so that the distance between the hairline and the spot between the top of the eyes was the same as the distance between the top of the eyes and the bottom of the nose, and that was the same distance as the distance between the bottom of the nose and the chin tip, right? So if a face had, equal proportions there, excellent. If the face had this, equal proportions here, so that I don't even know how this works. The distance, your nose width should be the distance, the width of your third eye. No, I'm kidding. An eye that would, if you had it, it should be equal to an eye width, in other words, even though you don't have an eye up there. And, other sorts of metrics can be, so the inside of your irises there should be equal to the width of your mouth, all these sorts of things. And it was something that artists did, right? And, you can potentially measure these on faces and that sort of thing. And what it was supposedly signaling was that it was a strong genetic makeup. Now, the golden proportions, few of us have certainly those sort of proportions. So I don't think that, that's probably not taken as literally anymore. But the idea that symmetry is something that indicates a stronger genetic makeup is probably something that our brains are evaluating when we look at faces to some degree. So seeing a person that does have a symmetric face is giving us information that they might have a stronger genetic makeup and will therefore have the ability to provide stronger, healthier offspring, which, is going to be advantageous for the species. So again, the idea here is that our detection of this aspect of facial attractiveness might be a way for us to choose mates that have the potential to provide strong, healthy offspring, which is good for the species, thereby allowing for an adaptive purpose for our brain's evaluation of facial attractiveness. What else? Well, going along with that, youthfulness, right? Across cultures, across history, people have found faces that seem to be more youthful as more attractive. And we know that this is something that's very heavily valued. I live in Los Angeles, and you don't have to go very far to see how much time and money and energy is into making one's face look younger. And, in some ways, that's the purpose of makeup. It's the purpose of Botox. It's the purpose of of, lots of different ways people try to make their look more youthful. And the idea there again could be, well, what that might be signaling is health and fertility. Now, again, this is probably all unconscious, why person, I have friends, both male and female, that are that have done Botox, and the idea is they're trying to get rid of those wrinkles to make their face look more youthful, dyeing one's hair so it doesn't look gray, making themselves look more youthful, and it's considered more attractive, I suppose. And the reason it might be considered more attractive is because it does signal, health and fertility. Youthfulness does signal health and fertility, and that would be another way that our I guess, preferences in facial attractiveness are maybe based on evolutionary purpose, right? Healthier offspring for younger mates. But here's one that you might find a little surprising: averageness. Okay, what does that mean, averageness? Well, so what I'm going to say here is that averageness, defined as, I guess, typicality, is something that people find attractive. And I think you'll find these experiments interesting if you've never heard about them before. These are faces you're seeing here that are actually composites. What is a composite? Well, they're faces that these are photographs of faces that were taken, in a very kind of systematic way. So everyone's kind of face could be lined up. And you can see here, all the faces are kind of lined up here. And what this allows us to do is to actually superimpose multiple face images on top of each other. Right. So I didn't do this experiment, but this is how these experiments were done. So what you're seeing here on the top is an image of an individual face. And then the next row you're seeing is a row of faces that were a composite. So I think 2 faces went into making this, right? All of these. And then 4 different faces went into making each of these. I don't know exactly what faces they were, but as you can see, as we take kind of 4 faces and superimpose them on each other, okay, the faces kind of start looking a little bit more average, a little bit more like the typical face, until down here you have 16 images, 16 face images making up each of these little photographs down here, okay? And if you show these to people, not in this order, not in this organization, but one at a time, and ask people to rate the attractiveness of the faces, it's the faces that have more composites, more kind of individual faces going into them, that people will rate more attractive. And the idea here is that these composite, with 16 faces going into them, are faces that are in some way more ideal. They're the more average looking faces, right? What I mean by average is they don't have, deviations. So the nose is now more idealized. It's not overly big or overly small. It's kind of averaged, right? The eye distance, the distance between the eyes isn't now, kind of a little bit too big like a single person might have, or a little bit too small like another single-bite person might have. If you take those 2 people and then add them to another 14 people, those eyes are going to be much more averaged. And those more kind of idealized average faces are generally considered more attractive. That's kind of a cool finding if you think about it. It's a little counterintuitive. Average faces are more attractive. Well, it's averaged in that these are now idealized faces, and they might be, in fact, conveying genetic normalcy, right? That face that has the good distance between the eyes and the kind of idealized nose and mouth and all that sort of thing, that's got to be a genetically healthy face, which of course is going to mean that it could be connected to a genetically healthy body that's going to have genetically healthy children and all that sort of thing. So that might be one reason why we consider, I guess, idealized or averaged faces more attractive. There's another reason too, and it's going to be a little bit of a tangent here. Oh, do I not have this? No, I do. Okay, prototypes. Let me go ahead and post that in. So what's a prototype? A prototype is a general concept that applies to all of perception, not just faces. And it's kind of related to a kind of perceptual memory of a class of stimuli, right? So let's talk about doggies. Not kitty cats. We're seeing kitty cats today, all right? No, doggies are better, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm going to have you imagine a doggie. Imagine your average doggie, okay? Not your doggie, an average dog. I bet when you imagine that dog, right, the average dog, it was probably closer to the size and kind of shape of something like a Labrador than a Chihuahua, okay? Now, again, I remember I told you not to imagine your dog, right? I imagine the average dog. Most of our average dogs are kind of our perceptual memory of the average dog is closer to a Labrador. It's kind of more like a moderate-sized dog, not a small dog like a Chihuahua, not a gigantic dog like a Great Dane. Okay, that's thinking of your average dog. What you were potentially doing there is you were thinking of what we would call the prototype dog. And that's the dog that kind of got, your dog memory that kind of got built up over all the dogs you've ever seen. It's your doggy average, right? The average dog is kind of something closer to a Labrador than it is a Chihuahua or a Great Dane. Okay, that's our prototypic dog. That also might occur with faces, right? So if I ask you to think of the average face, that's kind of hard, I suppose. It's much easier with doggies, but you still do have, even if it's hard to think of right now, you still do have a kind of prototypic face in your perceptual memory. Okay, such that when you see something like an average face, it kind of makes, very easy connections with your prototypic face, which might be another reason that you find them attractive, right? Right? Just like it's easier to imagine a dog as being a Labrador. And in fact, if you were shown a picture of a Labrador and asked whether or not it was a dog versus shown a picture of a Chihuahua or a Great Dane, you'd respond, yes, they're all dogs. You'd say they're all dogs, but you'd respond faster with the Labrador because it's closer to your prototype, okay? In the same way with faces, because these average faces, these average / idealized faces are closer to your prototype, you recognize it as a face faster, which also might have some bearing on the fact that you think these are attractive faces, the ease with which you process them. They connect to your prototypes, your perceptual prototypes more easily. Okay. Cool. Let's see what we can do next. Yeah, let's go ahead and do our question now and see if there's any questions from you folks. Not a lot of chat. Rachel asked, do animals like dogs perceive faces the same way we do? Very, very good question. They can recognize faces, I believe. Dogs can recognize faces. They can recognize some expression, I believe. I don't know about other animals. Yes, I think there is evidence that birds can recognize human faces to some degree. It's a good question. I don't know much beyond that. The question is, I suppose, the more relevant question right now, though, is whether they have the same sort of specialized processes that it seems that humans might have for faces. And I would bet the answer for that is no, right? So you can recognize some dogs based on photographs of their faces, but I would imagine we don't have a specialization for doggy faces. In fact, I'm going to show you evidence later that we probably don't. So there's one thing to be able to recognize a face, and I think that's a great question, Jen. I think the answer is yes. Or who asked that? Yeah, Rachel asked it initially. But they probably don't have the specialized processes that we're talking about. I know crows and I think ravens are very good at remembering human faces. Yeah, I think you're right, John. And I think I read that too. Very cool. Okay, let's do our question, polling question. This is right based on our last slide. It has to do with average faces. Which of the following has been offered as an explanation for average faces being considered attractive? Which of the following has been offered as an explanation for average faces being considered attractive? A, genetic normalcy. B, prototype representation for average faces. C, display rules, which you haven't learned about yet. And D, the answer, both A and B. Okay. Okay, another 10 seconds or so. And you ace this one again. The correct answer, of course, is D. Genetic normalcy. Some of you might have missed this one since a few of you got answer B. Genetic normalcy might be why we find average faces or idealized faces attractive, right? You know, if it has the kind of typical eye distance width and nose size and all that sort of thing, it's, you know, probably the more genetically normal face, a normalized face. But of course, prototypes also play a role in this. So the answer to this one is both A and B. Display rules you haven't learned about yet. You're going to learn about in 2 slides. Oh, wait a second. Yes. Oh my. Okay. 1 slide. All right. How are we doing with time? You know, I got a minute. Just let me go ahead and do this. Let me continue because I'm really needing to fit everything in here. So let's talk a little bit about facial expression and talk a little bit about whether there are cultural universals to facial expression. And this is the sort of thing you do learn usually in intro class, that there might be some cultural universality. So whether people in Papua New Guinea, it's a culture often cited that have, you know, that don't have at least when this was tested back in the 50s, didn't have access to you know, photographs or any way of seeing, you know, photographs of Western faces, whether in Papua New Guinea, whether they would perceive facial expression in the same way. And interestingly, what do I have here? Yeah, let's leave it at that. This is a bit of a story and I don't have enough time for the story. So we'll leave it there and we will continue talking about facial expression on Thursday. All right, see you then.